In 2006, Emirates started a flight between Hamburg and JFK. Pan Am started the route in 1959 as a tag-on flight from Heathrow before making it non-stop in 1985 and upgrading it to the Boeing 747. Then Pan Am sold its Atlantic, or most of its Atlantic network, over to Delta in 1991 when they took the route over. American entered the market in 1989 via Brussels, while Lufthansa added Hamburg to Newark, which was quite unusual for them since for decades they had prioritized growth at their hub in Frankfurt. The Berlin Wall had just fallen, and the population within the city was rising for the first time in decades. But despite this, American quickly reallocated its planes towards a hub in Miami, while Delta faced financial struggles, so they pulled back. Meanwhile, airlines like KLM, British Airways, and Air France were building massive connecting hubs at airports like Amsterdam's Schiphol, London's Heathrow, and Paris' Charles de Gaulle Airport. While these hubs were growing, code-sharing became increasingly common, where airlines would sell tickets on other airlines, such as a Northwest flight from Detroit to Amsterdam, then connecting to Hamburg instead. The one exception came from Continental, who started a non-stop flight to Hamburg from their growing hub at Newark Airport on a Boeing 757. Since the plane was smaller, it made the economics work and more closely matched demand. And since Continental had a hub in Newark, it meant that it not only relied on people flying between Hamburg and the Big Apple, but could connect people across the entire US. But since Continental with their 757 only offered about 16 seats in business class and only 100-something in economy, Emirates saw an opportunity. They believed Hamburg's growing presence and strong economy could justify this new service. The timing was perfect, not only because Germany had just recently hosted the World Cup, but also because just 2 years earlier they announced service to JFK, which quickly went to 2 daily flights and was now going to 3 daily flights. Where while Hamburg isn't really a tourist destination, though they do have Miniature Wonderland, that's the best place in the world, by the way, they could fill up the cabin with people who were traveling between Germany and the US, visiting family, friends, and relatives with this new connection with Hamburg. Emirates knew that acquiring slots at JFK was one of their top priorities. It was already very difficult to get any slots, so they had to get in there as soon as they could. This strategy also avoided the extra cost of a longer flight to Dubai, where Emirates was still growing its connecting banks so that it could flow passengers to destinations all over the world. A third flight may have been a little bit too much too fast, since passengers may have had to wait several hours for their connecting flights and they would just choose a competitor instead. But on the flip side, Emirates thought that they wouldn't receive much of a competitive response from airlines like Lufthansa, and they were right. Why? Well, Lufthansa had a hub in Frankfurt, which was already massively developed. By taking an aircraft out, especially for a long flight like to New York from Hamburg, which requires one plane per day pretty much, then that is a massive opportunity cost since there's no connecting feed for them. So that's why they instead have a pretty much hourly shuttle between Hamburg and Frankfurt, so passengers can then go to anywhere in the world pretty much, or wherever Lufthansa flies from Frankfurt. But for Emirates, there were limits. All the way back in 1994, an aviation agreement on air service between Germany and the UAE restricted airlines from the UAE to not serve more than 4 cities. And Hamburg was the last city that Emirates added in 2006, as they had already added Düsseldorf, Frankfurt, and Munich. So they looked for creative ways to diversify their network and grow. The EU and the US had an open skies agreement, meaning that airlines flying between the 2 continents could pretty much add capacity as they saw fit. And since the Hamburg to New York flight technically originated in Dubai, where Emirates could legally carry passengers solely between Hamburg and JFK and vice versa, because as a Fifth Freedom flight, the flight originated or ended in the home country, the UAE. And for a while it worked. Fuel prices were low, and demand for flights across the Atlantic were breaking records. But by 2008, everything had changed. Fuel prices skyrocketed, and demand from business class, first class, to economy had collapsed. Hamburg to JFK with Emirates wasn't immune. The flight had load factors or were less than 60% of the seats were occupied, and if it was even lower in premium cabins, since that's where the load factor really matters, then that's probably why the route came to an end. But a couple of other things were going on. Lufthansa was still funneling connecting passengers to their hub in Frankfurt, which had lounges, upgrades, passengers could collect points, and Lufthansa, at a much lower cost, could adjust its schedule between Hamburg and Frankfurt as it saw fit for how many people needed to connect. While many routes were cut, Continental 757 was perhaps the perfect size since it survived all the route cuts that airlines were making. It also didn't help that Emirates solely pretty much just had to rely on point-to-point travelers or those who were just traveling between New York and Hamburg and vice versa, while everybody else had all these extra options. But something even more significant had also happened in 2008. It's the same year that a new terminal at Dubai's airport would open, which would make the capacity of the airport increased to over 60 million, with Emirates being the main airline taking advantage of this. Meaning that, for a while, Emirates probably didn't have as much of an appetite to serve unnecessary Fifth Freedom routes, so they could then grow their connecting banks in Dubai. And for a while, it seemed like the slots at JFK weren't a priority. When Emirates ended their flight from Hamburg to JFK, they didn't retain that slot. It didn't come back until 2013, when they started a new Fifth Freedom flight to Milan using their established brand as a premium airline. At this point, many more people had known about Emirates, and of course, routes like Milan with banking, fashion, finance, and all of that turned out to be a more sustainable option. A year later, they finally went nonstop to Dubai 3 times a day on the A380, and by 2017, they had launched another new Fifth Freedom route from Athens to Newark, another premium market. But what this tells us is that there was still potential for Emirates to do more. United, which had inherited the route from Continental after they merged with them, ended flights between Hamburg and Newark in 2019, which was the same year that the mayor of Hamburg had visited the UAE, and as a part of that visit had chatted with the president of Emirates, Tim Clark, to bring them back on the Hamburg route, where Emirates over the years was still monitoring the market, the potential growth that Hamburg could still see, and the fact that there was now no competition. But there were hurdles. Since Emirates had given up one of their slots a few years ago, it was going to be probably even more difficult for them to get it back, especially since if Emirates were to start this route to Hamburg, they probably wouldn't do so on an A380. That would be way too many seats, so if they were to downgrade it to a 777, then they would be taking seats out of New York, something they probably don't want to do. Additionally, getting approval for a Fifth Freedom flight now may be more difficult than in the past, since all the countries still have to agree on the service. Getting approval for such a route could be more challenging than it was 20 years ago due to opposition from US airlines, the fact that Emirates already has a couple of routes no other airlines do, Middle Eastern carriers across the Atlantic, and also Lufthansa could push back on this. And despite no competition on the route, it could come back with new aircraft technology like the Airbus A321XLR, which has both small size and long range to serve the market, so it can perfectly meet supply with demand. On the flip side, Emirates could also do better. They could have a better timing with a slot, while new planes are coming into their fleet, like the Boeing 787, which could more closely meet supply with demand. I actually picked this up at Miniature Wonderland when I was 9 years old. I had some planes, but, you know, as a kid, they broke.